Constitutional history is so fractured. We've had a series of constitutions, beginning with the initiative of the British colonialists, right through to the processes that all of us are very familiar with. In my little experience, and thanks to President Obasanjo, who appointed me as Secretary of the Political Reform Conference, I've had a little bit of closeness in looking at the issues and the debate. One of the most frustrating things for me in looking at the history of Nigeria's struggle with constitutionalism is the process itself of making a constitution. And if you compare it, and the paper tries to look at that, but I probably won't go into it, is that unlike the making of the American Constitution, about which I spent a little bit of time in the paper, because the Americans, when they were making their constitution, at least had sources of inspiration, whether it was the Declaration of Independence in 1776, or the American Constitution itself, which came into being in 1787, or the Emancipation Proclamation, in which Abraham Lincoln made the defining statement: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are the rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness." That means that essentially the Americans, in making their constitution, allowed for the fact that there has to be enough space for every individual to pursue, as a matter of right, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The next is the Gettysburg speech, which Abraham Lincoln delivered on the 19th of November in 1863. And it speaks to the issues, because that is where we find our definition of democracy. So American constitutionalism drew inspiration from a range of scholars, whether it's Machiavelli, John Locke, the Bible itself, Thomas Hobbes, Rousseau, Thomas Paine, Burke, Mills, and even Karl Marx himself. And the result of all this is that you have, in the American Constitution, a document, although it has been subjected to amendments, but you can see very clearly that there was a historical and ideological background to the framing of the American Constitution. In our own situation in Nigeria, part of our problem, in my own little experience, has been the process of even electing those who are going to talk about writing the new constitution. Now, the Political Reform Conference that I served in, we had 400 members. Compare it to the number of those who had to write the American Constitution. And for me, one of the very interesting things, people like Thomas Madison and some of the framers of the Constitution, it's amazing to see the depth of knowledge and the effort that people made to acquire so much knowledge preparatory to writing the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson, for example, was said to have, he was living in France, when the issue of writing the Constitution came about. And his friend Madison requested that he should please help him find enough material that they will study. And his friend sent him 195 books just to prepare for this very important assignment. I make the point because if you compare it with the Nigerian situation, where coming to participate in making of the Constitution is always at the discretion of the person who is the president, and he uses other sources of information. But I found that the struggle to represent traditional rulers, to represent the church, to represent all kinds of aggregate groups, ends up with a lot of people with very little understanding of what constitution making is. And what became very clear to me, that most of the people who showed up saw the place as a theater for politicking and political transaction. So you can run through the Nigerian situation, but long story short, it is that first of all, there are no perfect constitutions anywhere in the world. And that in the final analysis, a constitution may be like the finest car that you can have, or the finest aeroplane. It depends on whose hands it is in. I stumbled on a poem, a very beautiful poem, which said that a racket is a racket, just for playing tennis. But it's not an ordinary thing for playing tennis if it is in the hands of Djokovic, or if it is in the hands of Serena Williams or Venus Williams. A football is an ordinary football, but in the feet of Messi, It's a completely different tool altogether. So the point is that a constitution ought to be able to meet certain objectives and ideals. But in the final analysis, it is not so much the quality of the constitution, it is the quality of the men and women who have to operate the constitution. So I would like to, as I said, maybe run through to the end of my paper, where I raise quite a few things, because that's where I discuss what I call, what is the future of constitutionalism in Nigeria? I need to do that so that, the members can have an opportunity to discuss the things that need to be discussed. The first is that let's not be exuberant about how far we have traveled on the path of democracy, in part because there were a lot of ideological contestations around the world, especially after 1989 with the collapse of the Berlin Wall, where many African scholars were talking about the new liberation of Africa, because they discovered that colonialism hadn't worked, but that successive military rules and one-man dictatorships across the continent had destroyed the foundations of our freedom, had elevated ethnicity, and created ample room and opportunity for all kinds of non-state actors to embarrass and subdue democracy. So the point to make is that the very fact that we are barely a few months since the departure of the last military general means that we must be modest in our talking about the depth of our democracy and how far we have traveled. The second point is to look at the state of Nigeria itself. Do we resemble a democracy? Do we work like a democracy? Do we talk like a democracy? Because the very fact that up till now, months after our elections and after swearing in a president, we still don't know who is going to be the president of Nigeria until the Supreme Court is over. Very much akin to the introduction of the video assistant referee in football, in which case we are like a man who has scored a goal, but we have to wait for the referee to go to VAR and confirm whether it was a goal or not a goal. It's not evident. It is a symptom of how modest our claims should be, because we very often confuse the very fact that we are in a civilian administration with the notions of being in a democracy. That if we cannot fix our electoral process, which is the defining law for how to choose leaders in a democracy, then we must be modest in our saying that we're in a democracy. Secondly, our judiciary is in a crisis. Crisis of perception, but also based on the experiences that Nigerians have had. It will not be surprising if ordinary Nigerians think that the only thing the Supreme Court does is to look at election petitions. Because we're looking up to the Supreme Court to help extend the frontiers of democracy and human freedoms. But very often, those institutions with Nigerians perceive that they've now become so severely, compromised. That has consequences for democracy and how we see the process of democratization. We also have a raft of agitations across the country. We have seen the worst face of corruption in Nigeria. Femi Falana, my friend here, will speak about that because he's published a series of articles, talking about what happened under the Buhari administration. They were not the ones who caused corruption, but I think in the last administration we saw the ugliest face of corruption in many, whether in moral terms, financial terms, or other terms. And I'll mention that before I close.